The lantern light caught the dress first. Theresa Bancroft stood frozen in the doorway of the Caldwell Grange Hall on the night of the 1883 Harvest Dance, her breath stolen clean from her lungs, her fingers pressed white against the door frame. Every head in that crowded room turned toward her, and the fiddle music did not stop, but it might as well have, because the silence that fell between the people who knew her and the woman standing in that doorway was louder than any tune ever played in Hays County, Kansas. She was wearing her mother's dress. The ivory silk with its hand-sewn bodice of tiny blue forget-me-nots, its full skirt that swept just above the floorboards, its delicate pearl buttons along the back that Theresa had fastened herself in the dark of her bedroom with trembling hands. Clara Bancroft had worn this dress to her own wedding in 1861, and she had kept it folded in cedar and lavender in the bottom of her hope chest, and she had been buried in the Kansas earth 11 months ago without it, because her dying wish had been that Theresa should wear it someday when the time was right. Theresa had chosen tonight, but the looks on the faces of the townspeople told her she had miscalculated the depth of their cruelty. Margaret Holloway, the banker's wife, leaned toward her companion and whispered something behind the cup of her gloved hand. Theresa could not hear the words, but she understood them. She had been hearing versions of those words her whole life. Poor Clara's girl, trying too hard, doesn't know her place. The Bancroft land is mortgaged to the hilt. Does she think a pretty dress is going to save her? Theresa's chin lifted by sheer force of will. She had come here tonight for reasons that had nothing to do with the dance and everything to do with survival. She had come because Jacob Holloway, Margaret's son, had been spreading a dark and poisonous rumor through Caldwell for the past 3 weeks, a rumor that she had forged her father's signature on a land deed, a rumor that could see her arrested, could see the Bancroft homestead taken from her before the first snow fell. She had come to face it. She had come wearing her mother's dress because she needed armor, and the most powerful armor she owned was the memory of a woman the whole town had loved before the grief and the drought, and the secrets had swallowed everything. She stepped fully inside the hall and let the door swing shut behind her. The music resumed, but the stares did not stop. And then, from the far side of the room, past the punch table and the baled hay decorations, and the circle of ranchers talking cattle prices, one man looked at her differently than all the rest. Not with pity, not with contempt, with something that she had not received from another human being in so long that it took her a moment to recognize it. He was looking at her like she had every right in the world to be standing exactly where she was. He was tall and lean in the way of men who worked under the sky, with dark hair gone dusty from the trail, and eyes the deep, quiet color of creek water in October. He wore a clean shirt and a vest the color of charcoal, and he had a hat in his hand instead of on his head, which told her he had manners. He held her gaze for just a moment before he crossed the room with a deliberate, unhurried ease, and when he stopped in front of her, he said nothing about the whispers or the stares or the dress or the rumors or any of the 100 sharp and painful things that filled the air of that Grange Hall like smoke. He said, "That dress suits you fine, miss," and Theresa Bancroft, who had not cried in 11 months, felt the back of her throat close up with something that had no clean name. She swallowed it. "Thank you," she said. His name was Phineas Barnett, and she did not know yet how completely he was about to change everything. The story of how they arrived at that moment in the doorway of the Caldwell Grange Hall is the kind of story that requires going back to the beginning, because the beginning holds the secrets, and the secrets hold the truth. Theresa Bancroft had grown up on 160 acres of Kansas grassland 12 miles east of Caldwell, in the tall grass country, where the wind never truly stopped, and the sky went on forever in every direction like a promise no one had made you but you believed anyway. Her father, Albert Bancroft, had homesteaded the land in 1870 under the Homestead Act, had built the house with his own hands, and the hands of 3 neighbors who came for a week and left with full bellies, and a standing invitation to return. He had married Clara Whitmore of Jefferson County in 1861, had waited through 4 years of war before he could bring her west, and when he finally did, Clara had pressed that ivory dress into the cedar chest and said she was keeping it for their daughter. Theresa was born in the spring of 1863, delivered in the back of a supply wagon during a late-season blizzard because her mother had gone into labor 2 weeks early during a supply run to the nearest town. She had come into the world fighting, and she had never entirely stopped. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn jaw, and a mind that moved quicker than either of them had ever accounted for. She had learned to read before she was 5 years old, taught herself sums by keeping the household accounts at 9, and by the time she was 12, she understood the family finances better than her father, which was not a comfortable thing to understand, because the Bancroft finances were a fragile and precarious structure built on hope and hard work, and the occasional good season that never quite lasted long enough. Albert Bancroft was a good man. He was not a clever man with money. He borrowed when he should have saved and trusted men he should have watched more carefully. And by 1880, the homestead carried a mortgage with the First Cattlemen's Bank of Caldwell that made Theresa's stomach cold when she thought about it. The banker was Silas Holloway, and Silas Holloway was a man who had built his fortune on the misfortunes of others, who smiled with his mouth and calculated with his eyes, and who had been quietly angling for the Bancrofts' water-rich eastern acreage for the better part of 3 years. Clara Bancroft had known it. Clara had warned Albert. Albert had nodded and agreed, and then continued to believe the best of people, which was one of his finest qualities, and also the quality most likely to destroy them. Clara died in October of 1882, quickly, a fever that came on hard and moved faster than anyone expected, and she was gone in 6 days. Theresa was 19 years old and stood at her mother's grave in the cold Kansas wind and felt the ground shift under her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the earth. Albert was shattered. He had loved Clara with the kind of love that does not know how to exist in the present tense after the beloved becomes past tense. He moved through the days after her death like a man walking underwater, performing the necessary actions of living without any real conviction that it mattered. Theresa had held the homestead together through that winter by will and calculation, and the kind of exhausted determination that does not feel heroic in the middle of it, only afterward if you are still standing. By spring, Albert had recovered enough to function, but not enough to be the man he had been. And in that spring, Silas Holloway had come calling with a new proposition about the eastern acreage, framing it as an opportunity, as relief from the debt pressure, as a gift, really, when you thought about it honestly. Theresa had sat at the kitchen table and listened and said nothing, and after Holloway left, she had told her father with absolute firmness that they would not be selling any portion of the land. Albert had agreed, but weakly, the way a man agrees when he is too tired to fight. It was 3 weeks before the Harvest Dance of 1883 when Jacob Holloway, Silas's 24-year-old son, who had been drinking at the Lucky Star Saloon on a Friday afternoon and running his mouth as was his habit, began telling people that he had seen Theresa Bancroft forge her father's signature on a land deed. He had no evidence. He had no witness. He had, in fact, invented the story from whole cloth, because his father had told him that the best way to force a property sale was to make the seller desperate, and nothing made a woman alone in a frontier town more desperate than the threat of legal jeopardy. The rumor spread the way all rumors spread in a small town, quickly, selectively, in ways that were very difficult to address directly, because by the time you heard it, it had passed through 10 mouths and come out wearing different clothes than it had started in. Theresa heard it on a Tuesday from Nora Price, who ran the dry goods store and who told her with genuine regret, and the particular pleasure that genuine regret sometimes cannot entirely conceal. Theresa thanked her, walked out of the dry goods store, stood in the middle of the main street of Caldwell with the October sun burning against the back of her neck, and understood with a terrible clarity that this was not just gossip. This was a trap, and it had been set deliberately, and it was designed to close around her before she could find a way out. She went home. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She thought about her mother, about what Clara would have done. Clara had always understood that the best way to answer a lie was not to explain it, but to make the truth so visible and so undeniable that the lie simply could not stand beside it in the same light. She opened the cedar chest in her parents' room. She lifted the ivory dress. She held it against herself and stood before the small looking glass on the wardrobe door and thought about the harvest dance that was coming in 3 weeks, the dance that every person in Caldwell and the surrounding county attended, the dance where everyone would see her and remember what they thought of her and decide accordingly. She made a decision. She did not know yet that a cowboy named Phineas Barnett would be at that dance, and that he would look at her across a room full of whispers and see something that the whispers had tried to hide. Phineas Barnett had come to Hays County by way of Texas, by way of the Kishom Trail, by way of a decade of choices that had seemed reasonable in the moment and collectively added up to a life spent largely in motion. He was 28 years old in the fall of 1883, which was old enough to know things and young enough to believe they might matter. He had been born in Nacogdoches, Texas, in 1855, the second son of a farrier and a schoolteacher, and had grown up with the particular combination of practicality and idealism that results from a father who fixes problems with his hands and a mother who fixes them with her mind. He had learned to ride before he could read and to read before he started school, and he had gone onto the cattle drives at 17 because the land was calling him north, and he did not yet understand that the land was a metaphor, and what it was really calling him toward was a life he could not yet see the shape of. He had worked for 3 different outfits over 10 years, had done the trail drives and the range work and the fence mending and the predator tracking, and all the 100 difficult and unglamorous tasks that the romantic notion of the cowboy life tended to leave out when it told itself the story. He had saved his money with more discipline than most of his contemporaries, had not lost it at cards or drunk it away, though he had been tempted in both directions, and by the fall of 1883 he had enough put by to consider doing something deliberate with it. What he was considering was land. He had heard about open range north of Caldwell, had heard a rancher named Buckmaster was looking to lease good grazing acreage through the winter while he sorted out a boundary dispute with a neighbor. It was a modest opportunity, not the thing he ultimately wanted, which was land of his own, but modest opportunities were often the path to larger ones, and Phineas had the patience to understand that. He had ridden into Caldwell on a Wednesday afternoon, stabled his horse at Garner's livery, taken a room at the Caldwell Hotel, and started making the acquaintance of the town. He had heard about the harvest dance from the hotel keeper, an enthusiastic promoter of local events named Fenwick, who told him it was the best social occasion in the county, and that everyone went, absolutely everyone, and that there would be excellent food and dancing, and it was the kind of thing that helped a man feel like he was somewhere instead of just passing through. Phineas had decided to go, partly because he was curious, and partly because he recognized the truth in what Fenwick said. He had been passing through for 10 years. He wanted to feel like he was somewhere. On the night of the dance, he had arrived early, positioned himself near the far wall with a glass of cider, and watched the room fill up with the social patterns of a community he did not yet know. He could read crowds fairly well from long practice. He could identify the centers of gravity, the people whose opinions shaped others, the fault lines of old conflicts that showed in the way 2 families arranged themselves on opposite sides of a room without appearing to do so consciously. He had noticed Silas Holloway and his wife and their son Jacob almost immediately, because they occupied the room with the particular ease of people who believe that everything in their immediate vicinity belongs to them by right. He had noticed the cluster of ranchers and their careful deference to Holloway's presence. He had noticed the way certain women watched the door with an expression that was equal parts anticipation and speculation. And then the door had opened, and Theresa Bancroft had walked in wearing ivory silk and forget-me-nots, and the room had shifted in its axis in a way that was subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. He had watched the whispers start. He had watched the faces arrange themselves into the particular configuration of collective cruelty that small communities achieve when they have decided collectively that someone is vulnerable. He had watched Theresa Bancroft's chin lift and her shoulders settle and her feet carry her into the room with a steadiness that cost her more than it appeared to cost, because he could see the cost of it in the set of her jaw and the slight whitening of her knuckles where her fingers had pressed together in front of her. He had crossed the room because it was the right thing to do. He had said what he said because it was the truest thing he could think of. In the immediate aftermath of those 6 words, Theresa stood with her composure intact and her heart beating considerably faster than she would have preferred, studying the man in front of her with the same careful attention she applied to any situation that held potential risk. "I don't believe I've seen you in Caldwell before," she said. "I arrived a few days ago," he said. His voice was steady and unhurried, a southern-tinged voice that had been worn smooth by years of open air. "Phineas Barnett. I'm looking at some grazing lease possibilities north of town." "Theresa Bancroft," she said. She watched his face for the flicker of recognition that the name would produce in anyone who had spent time in Caldwell in the past 3 weeks, but she did not see what she expected. What she saw instead was simple, direct interest. "Are you from the county?" he asked. "Born here," she said. "My family has a homestead east of town, 160 acres. "That's good land out that way," he said. "The Buckmaster spread is about 8 miles north of you, I think." He knew the land. That told her something. Men who knew the land were, in her experience, more trustworthy than men who knew only the town, because the land was honest in ways that towns were not. They were interrupted by the arrival of a fiddle flourish that signaled the beginning of a reel, and the dancers moved to form their lines, and in the reshuffle and motion of people taking their places, Theresa found herself standing slightly apart from the main current of the room. Phineas had not moved away. "May I bring you a glass of punch?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "You can," she said, "and then you can tell me how long you intend to stay in Caldwell." He brought the punch. They stood near the edge of the dance floor, and he told her that he did not have a fixed departure date, that it depended on the outcome of his conversation with Buckmaster, that he had not ruled out staying on if the circumstances warranted it. She listened with the particular attention she gave to information that might matter, and she decided that he was telling her the truth, which was rarer at a harvest dance than it ought to be. She had been watching Jacob Holloway across the room while they talked, watching him hold court with a group of younger men, watching him glance toward her, and away with the studied casualness of someone who is aware of being watched. His presence in the room was a constant low hum of threat, and she was calculating the best moment to address it when a new element complicated the picture. Jacob Holloway began moving toward her. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never been told no in a way that stuck, who has never faced a consequence that his father's money could not redeem. He was reasonably well dressed and had his mother's pale coloring and his father's acquisitive eyes, and when he reached Theresa he executed a small, mocking bow. "Miss Bancroft," he said, "what a surprise to see you here. I wouldn't have thought you'd have much to celebrate this fall, given your circumstances." Phineas Barnett, standing one step behind Theresa's right shoulder, said nothing, but he also did not step away. Theresa kept her voice entirely even. "My circumstances are entirely adequate, thank you, Jacob." "Are they?" He let his gaze travel to the dress with the deliberate rudeness of someone who wants to be understood but not caught. "That's a lovely dress. Your mother's, isn't it? I remember seeing her wear it before she passed." The cruelty in the observation was precisely calibrated. Theresa felt it land, felt the specific sting of it, and allowed herself a single heartbeat of pure reaction before she sealed it away. "It is my mother's," she said, with a warmth and steadiness in her voice that she was genuinely proud of afterward. "And I believe it suits her memory to bring it out on a festive occasion. She loved to dance." Jacob's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He had expected distress. He was receiving graciousness. These were not the same thing, and they did not serve the same purpose for him. "I imagine you'll be managing the homestead alone going forward," he said, "your father's health being what it is." "My father is in good health," Theresa said, which was mostly true and entirely none of Jacob Holloway's concern. "I'm glad to hear it." He smiled with the part of his face that smiled. "I imagine it would be difficult for a woman alone to manage the legal complexities of property ownership, documents, deeds, signatures, that sort of thing." There it was, the threat lying flat and plain on the surface of the conversation like a knife set down carefully on a table. Theresa met his eyes. "I manage all of those things very competently," she said. "I always have." He held her gaze for a moment longer, and something shifted in his expression, the recognition that she was not going to fold, which produced in him not respect but a recalibration of approach. He had a second strategy. He would use it. "Well," he said pleasantly, "I do hope you enjoy the dance, Miss Bancroft." Shifted his gaze to Phineas. "I don't believe we've met. Are you new to Caldwell?" "Phineas Barnett," Phineas said. His voice had not changed in tone or warmth, but something in it had settled more firmly, the way a man plants his feet when he has decided where he is standing. "I arrived this week." Passing through, Jacob asked with an inflection that hoped very much for an affirmative answer. "Not necessarily," Phineas said. Jacob looked between them once, executed another small nod, and withdrew. Theresa released a breath she had been holding, without fully realizing it. She turned slightly toward Phineas and found him watching Holloway's retreat with the focused, calm attention of a man assessing a situation. "You know what that was," she said. "It was not a question." "I know what it looked like," he said. She turned to face him more fully. "He has been telling people that I forged my father's signature on a land deed. It is entirely false. But his father wants our eastern acreage, and this is how they intend to acquire it. By making me afraid enough or legally endangered enough that I sell it at whatever price they name." She watched his face. She had not intended to say all of that. She had not intended to say any of it, not to a stranger, not on the first night of meeting. But something about the way he stood, the quality of his attention, had pulled the honesty out of her before she had finished deciding whether to offer it. He was quiet for a moment. "Do you have the deed?" he asked. "I have every document this family ever produced," she said. He nodded, slowly. "Then the truth is there," he said. "The question is finding someone with the authority to hear it." This was the beginning of it. Over the following 3 days, something careful and deliberate grew between Theresa Bancroft and Phineas Barnett. It was not the kind of thing that announces itself with dramatic proclamation, but rather the kind that reveals itself gradually, in the accumulation of specific moments, each one small enough to be dismissed and together impossible to deny. On the morning after the dance, Phineas rode out to the Bancroft homestead. He rode out because he had thought about her all night, about the dress and the whispers and the particular courage of a woman who walks into a room that is doing its best to make her feel unwelcome and holds her head up anyway. But he rode out with a practical purpose, because practical purposes were the kind of purposes a man could act on without claiming more than he knew yet to be true. He told her, when she came to the door and looked at him with those dark, assessing eyes, that he knew a man in Caldwell who served as a notary public and had also read law, a retired attorney from St. Louis, named Elias Croft, who had come west for his health and stayed for the sky, and that if her documents were as clear as she believed them to be, Croft might be the person to help her establish their legitimacy formally and publicly in a way that would make the Holloways' rumor strategy impossible to sustain. She stood in the doorway of her family's house for a moment, studying him. Behind her he could see the interior of the homestead, the scrubbed wood table and the cast-iron stove and the shelves of preserved goods and the braided rag rug on the floor, all of it speaking of a woman's careful maintenance of order against the constant pressure of circumstance. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He considered the question honestly, the way it deserved to be considered. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said. "And because you were the only true thing in that room last night." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "Come in. I'll put coffee on and show you the documents." He tied his horse to the fence post and went inside, and the kitchen felt like something he had not been inside in a long time, a space that had been cared for, that held the evidence of a life lived with intention. And he sat at the table and drank coffee that was strong and good while Theresa brought out a battered tin box and set it on the table between them. Inside the box were documents going back to 1870. The original homestead claim, the patent certificate, every deed and mortgage note, and tax record and correspondence with the land office in the 13 years of the Bancroft family's tenure on that land. She laid them out with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew exactly what was there and had already thought carefully about what each one would mean in a legal context. He looked at them. He was not a lawyer, but he had read enough in his life to understand what he was seeing, and what he was seeing was an unambiguous, clearly documented chain of title that had been properly recorded and properly maintained. There was no forgery. There was no irregularity. There was simply an honest record of a family's claim to their land preserved with care. "These are clear," he said. "I know they are," she said. "Holloway knows it too," he said. "Yes," she said. Which is why he needed the rumor rather than an actual legal challenge. He looked up at her. She was sitting across the table from him, her hands folded on the wood surface, her expression composed in the way of someone who has had to learn composure as a survival skill rather than a social grace. She had dark eyes with a directness in them that he found himself thinking about in the way you think about something you want to look at for a long time. "Then what Croft can do," Phineas said, "is what lawyers call quiet title. It's a legal proceeding that formally establishes ownership and puts the documentation into the public record in a way that can't be questioned or whispered away. It costs money and it takes time, but it makes the Holloway's position impossible." She was still for a moment. "How do you know about quiet title proceedings?" He almost smiled. "My mother was a schoolteacher who read law books in her spare time because she thought they were interesting," he said. "Some of it stuck." She did smile briefly, and it changed her face in a way that hit him somewhere in the chest. They rode into town together that afternoon. Elias Croft was a small, tidy man of 60, with an enormous white mustache and the careful eyes of someone who has spent decades reading human behavior in courtrooms. He received them in his parlor, which was lined with bookshelves from floor to ceiling, and he listened to Theresa lay out the situation with the same focused attention that Phineas had already come to associate with men who took their obligations seriously. Croft examined the documents for 45 minutes without speaking, making occasional small notations on a pad of paper. Then he set down his pen and looked at Theresa over the top of his reading spectacles. "These are excellent," he said. "Entirely unimpeachable. Whoever told you these were forged was either misinformed or lying, and from what you're describing, it was the latter." Theresa accepted this with a nod that held all the dignity of someone who knew it and had been waiting for someone else to confirm it. "What can I do?" she asked. "I can file a quiet title action in the district court," Croft said. "We have a circuit judge coming through Caldwell in 6 weeks. It will cost you approximately $40 in filing fees and my time, which I will offer to you at a reduced rate because this is the most interesting case I have seen since I left St. Louis, and also because I do not like Silas Holloway." Theresa had $41 in her household savings. She said, "Let's begin." On the ride back from Croft's house, the October afternoon had gone golden and long, the kind of light that made the Kansas grasslands look like something in a painting rather than a place you lived and worked and worried in every day. Phineas rode at Theresa's side on the narrow track between the fields, and they talked, really talked, in the way that happens when two people have just accomplished something together, and the accomplishment has cleared a path for the conversation. She told him about her mother, about Clara's practicality and her warmth, and the way she had kept the homestead not just functioning, but genuinely alive with the feeling that it was worth living in. She told him about the cedar chest and the dress, about the decision she had made to wear it to the dance, about what it had felt like to put it on, and to stand in her mother's room in her mother's dress and feel both the weight of the loss and something she could only describe as presence, as if the dress itself carried some residue of Clara's spirit. He listened without interruption, which was a rarer quality than it ought to be, and she noticed it the way you notice the absence of something you expect but do not usually receive. When she finished, he told her about his mother in Nacogdoches, who was still alive and still teaching, who wrote him letters that were always full of book recommendations, and weather observations and the occasional pointed remark about the fact that he had not yet settled anywhere. He said it with a wry affection that told her he took his mother seriously and was also a little afraid of disappointing her. "She wants you to plant roots," Theresa said. "She wants me to be happy," he said. "I think she believes those are the same thing." "Are they?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved through the golden light. "I didn't know before," he said. "I think I might be starting to." She looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said what that meant, but the saying was there between them anyway, visible and undenied. At the Bancroft homestead gate, she thanked him for the introduction to Croft. He said it was nothing. She said it was not nothing. It was in fact the opposite of nothing. It was the beginning of a solution, and she had been alone with the problem for 3 weeks, and that was a long time to carry something without help. He was quiet for a beat of time. Then he said, "You don't have to carry it alone anymore." She nodded once with the careful reserve of someone who wants to believe a thing, but has learned to be cautious about the wanting. "Good evening, Mr. Barnett," she said. "Good evening, Miss Bancroft," he said. He rode back to town with the feeling of a man who has just understood something fundamental about the direction of his life. The 6 weeks before the circuit judge arrived were 6 weeks of slow revelation and careful trust, built in increments, in the way that things built to last are always built. Phineas went out to the Bancroft homestead every few days, always with a purpose, always with a reason that was genuine even when it was also an excuse. He brought lumber one afternoon and helped Albert Bancroft repair a section of fence that had been failing since summer. He brought a book that Elias Croft had recommended for Theresa, a legal reference that would help her understand the proceedings. He came on a Sunday and stayed for supper, and Albert Bancroft, who had been a withdrawn and diminished version of himself since Clara's death, found in Phineas a man he could talk to about the practical realities of maintaining land against drought and debt and difficult neighbors, and something in those conversations seemed to restore in Albert a thread of his former purpose. Theresa watched this happen with a gratitude that went very deep. She also watched Phineas himself, with the careful, analytic attention she brought to anything that mattered. She watched the way he worked, which was without complaint and with genuine competence, the way of a man who respects the work rather than performing the respect. She watched the way he treated her father, with a combination of honest regard and practical assistance that managed to honor Albert's dignity while actually getting things done. She watched the way he spoke to her directly, without the condescension that many men of the era brought to conversations with women, as if he had simply never absorbed the assumption that her intelligence was lesser. She was falling in love with him. She knew it with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who is also frightened by what they know. Because she had obligations. She had the land and her father and the legal battle and the mortgage and the 100 daily needs of a working homestead that required her full attention and energy. She had made herself into the kind of person who could sustain all of that, which had required a certain narrowing of focus, a certain deliberate setting aside of things that felt like luxuries. Love, she had told herself during the long months after her mother's death, was a luxury she could not afford. Phineas was making the argument without words, simply by existing in her vicinity, that she had been wrong about this. He had gone out to the Buckmaster spread and arranged the grazing lease, which meant he was now based north of Caldwell for the winter, which meant he would be in the county, which was not an accident. He had admitted this to her on an afternoon in early November when they were sitting on the fence rail of her family's pasture watching the sun go down and the shadows of the grass go long and purple. "You took the Buckmaster lease," she said, "because it kept you here." "Yes," he said. He was not a man who evaded. She considered this. "And you intend to stay beyond the lease?" "That depends," he said. "On what?" He looked at her, and the directness of it was something she felt in her chest. "On whether the things I've found here are the things I've been looking for," he said. She held his gaze. "Tell me what you found," she said. "Work that means something," he said. "Land that speaks to me. A man I respect." He paused, and the pause held the third item very specifically. "And a woman who walked into a room full of people doing their best to diminish her and refused to be diminished." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the grass in the way it always did, the way it had done for as long as she could remember, the sound she had grown up with and sometimes found comforting and sometimes found relentless. "I was terrified," she said. "That night at the dance. I was wearing my mother's dress and I was terrified." "I know," he said. "That's what made it brave." She turned to look at the sunset, which was extraordinary in the way Kansas sunsets are extraordinary, not with a mountain's drama but with a wide sky abundance that has nowhere to hide its beauty. "Phineas," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm not a woman who does things by halves," she said. "When I decide something, I decide it fully. I need you to understand that before we continue." He waited. "I think I am deciding something," she said. He was very still. Then he said quietly, "So am I." She turned back to him, and what she saw in his face, clear and unguarded and entirely certain, was enough. She reached out and took his hand, and he turned his palm up and held hers, and they sat on the fence rail in the failing November light with the wind moving the grass around them, and the warmth of the contact between their hands saying everything that neither of them had yet put into sentences. This was when the second part of the trouble began. Jacob Holloway had been watching the situation develop with the growing displeasure of a man who had expected his trap to close and found instead that the prey had somehow acquired assistance. He had watched Phineas Barnett appear at the dance, had watched him align himself with Theresa Bancroft with a steadiness that was clearly not accidental, had watched Croft file the quiet title action with the district court, which had reached his father's ears within 24 hours through the elaborate network of favor and intelligence that Silas Holloway maintained throughout the county. Silas was not pleased. A quiet title action, if it succeeded, would not only protect the Bancroft land from legal challenge, but would make future maneuvering by the Holloways considerably more complicated. The rumor strategy was now neutralized, because it looked foolish in the face of a formal legal proceeding that clearly assumed the ownership was legitimate. Something more direct was required. What Silas devised was a foreclosure notice. The Bancroft mortgage had been in technical default for 2 months, because a September payment had been short by $14 due to a poor harvest season. Silas had accepted this shortfall at the time without comment, had in fact waived the deficiency with an apparent generosity that Albert Bancroft had been genuinely grateful for. He had done this because he was saving it. He sent the foreclosure notice on a Thursday in mid-November. It cited the September deficiency and 2 technical covenant violations buried in the mortgage language, conditions about property maintenance that the Bancrofts had been unaware of, and that Silas had never raised because he had been waiting for the right moment to use them as weapons. Theresa received the notice on a Friday morning and felt the cold move through her from the outside in. She was at Croft's door within 2 hours. Croft read the notice with the focused attention of a man who knows exactly what he is looking for and the grimmer version of his expression told her what she needed to know before he said it. "This is aggressive," he said. "The September deficiency is real. The covenant violations are real but trivial. Any fair-minded judge would dismiss them. The problem is that the circuit judge coming through is Aldous Weathering, who has ruled in Holloway's favor twice before on property matters. He may not be corrupt, but he is sympathetic to landholders with money, which is not your client profile." "What are my options?" she asked. "You can cure the default by paying the full arrears plus the penalty, which under the mortgage terms would be approximately $200. That stops the foreclosure regardless of what Weathering thinks. Or you can challenge the foreclosure in court and hope Weathering decides to be fair." $200. Theresa sat very still. She had $41. Her father had perhaps 20 in the house. She had a cow and 3 pigs and a mule and 18 acres of winter wheat that would not be worth money until spring if the season cooperated. She left Croft's office and walked directly to the telegraph office and sent a wire to her father's brother in Abilene, explaining the situation in the economical language of the telegram. She did not know if her uncle could help. She did not know if he would. She and her father had not been in close contact with that branch of the family in years, a distance created by old grievances that she had never entirely understood, and her parents had never fully explained. She walked out of the telegraph office into the November afternoon, and Phineas was there, because he had ridden into town for supplies and had stopped at Croft's office after seeing her horse hitched outside, and Croft had told him. He looked at her with the same clear, steady regard he always gave her, and she felt the complicated relief and also the complication of the relief, the awareness that needing his help was both a gift and a vulnerability. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She told him the number. She watched his face, not for pity, which she would not have been able to accept without something breaking in her, but for the honest assessment she had come to trust. "I have savings," he said. She shook her head immediately. "Theresa," he said. "No," she said. "I will not take your savings. That is your land money. That is what you've been working toward for 10 years. "I know what it is," he said. "Then you know I cannot accept it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through it, respecting her position and also not willing to simply stand aside. This was one of the things she loved about him. He did not need to be right. He needed to be honest. "A loan," he said, "at whatever terms you name, secured against the property once the title is clear." She looked at him. "You would tie your savings to land you have no claim to," she said, "on the promise of a woman you have known for 6 weeks. "I would," he said, with the complete simplicity of total certainty. Something moved through her that was not anything she had a clean name for. It was the feeling of being seen and chosen simultaneously, and it was the most terrifying and most beautiful thing she had experienced since she stood in her mother's room and put on the ivory dress. "Let me wait for my uncle's reply," she said. "Give me a week." He gave her a week. Her uncle's reply came in 3 days. His name was William Bancroft, and he was a cattle broker in Abilene who had done well for himself, and who responded to Theresa's wire with a longer telegram than she expected, and then followed it with a letter that arrived 2 days later. He had heard about Clara's death and had grieved it in his private way, and he had not come because of the old grievance with Albert that had been about a debt and a broken promise, and he had thought the bitterness would last, but reading his niece's clear-eyed description of her situation had dissolved something in him. He would send $150. He could not make it 200, but he could make it 150, and if Phineas Barnett was willing to put in the remaining 50, which William had gathered from the way Theresa's telegram described the situation was not entirely off the table, then they could cure the default. Theresa sat with the letter for a long time. She rode to the Buckmaster spread and found Phineas mending fence in the north pasture, which was the kind of task that gave a man long hours to think in, and she rode up beside him and dismounted and stood with the letter in her hand. "My uncle will send 150, she said. He straightened from the fence wire. He looked at her. "And you're here," he said. "I'm here," she said. "The remaining 50, he said. "Yes," she said, "if the offer still stands." He did not say anything. He set down the fence tool he was holding and walked to where she stood, and he took the letter from her hand and read it with the same careful attention he gave everything that mattered, and then he folded it and handed it back. "The offer stands," he said. She took the letter. She was standing very close to him. The November wind had gone cold and sharp, and the sky was the pale gray-blue of deep autumn, and she could see the particular warmth in his eyes that was. She understood now with the finality of completed understanding, specifically for her. "Phineas," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she said everything, directly, without performance, with the full weight of a woman who means what she says. He was absolutely still for a moment. Then something in his expression moved and settled into the most complete and unguarded thing she had ever seen on a human face, an openness that held nothing back. "I love you," he said. "I have been certain of it since you walked into that dance hall and refused to apologize for who you are." She took one step toward him and he closed the remaining distance, and when he kissed her, it was with the same steadiness he brought to everything, unhurried and entirely sure, and the cold wind moved around them in the November pasture, and neither of them noticed it. The following week was one of the most eventful weeks of Theresa Bancroft's life, and her life had not suffered from a deficit of eventful weeks. William Bancroft's bank draft arrived on a Monday. Phineas transferred his $50 on Tuesday. Croft prepared the cure of default payment in the correct legal form, itemizing the arrears, the penalty, the technical covenant remediation, and delivered it in person to the First Cattlemen's Bank on Wednesday morning, with Theresa present and Phineas standing by the door. Silas Holloway was not in the bank. His head teller received the payment with an expression of carefully maintained neutrality that told Theresa absolutely nothing about his internal state. She signed the receipt and walked out into the Wednesday morning sun with the cure of default in her hand and the foreclosure threat legally extinguished. The quiet title hearing was scheduled for the following Friday. In the 3 days between, Jacob Holloway made one more attempt. He approached Phineas at Garner's livery on Thursday afternoon, a meeting that was not accidental, and offered him money. He offered him $300 to leave Caldwell and take his business elsewhere. He phrased it as a business proposition, as an investment opportunity, as a suggestion that there were better prospects for a man of Barnett's obvious abilities in territories to the west. Phineas listened to the entire proposition with the specific quality of stillness that Theresa had come to understand, indicated that he was doing his most focused thinking. Then he said, "Tell your father the answer is no. The answer will continue to be no. And if either of you approaches me or Miss Bancroft again with anything that resembles a threat or a bribe, I will be speaking to Elias Croft about whether there are legal remedies applicable to what you just described." Jacob Holloway left the livery considerably less composed than he had entered it. Phineas told Theresa about it that evening at the homestead, over supper, while Albert listened with the particular attention of a man who had been slow to wake up and was now fully awake. Albert Bancroft looked at Phineas Barnett across the kitchen table that had been Clara's table and the Bancroft family's table for 13 years, and he said, "Son, I owe you more than I can repay." Phineas shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, sir. Your daughter did all the work, I just helped." Albert looked at Theresa. He looked at the two of them, the way they sat and the way they did not quite sit, the current between them that was visible to any paying attention. He looked at the daughter who had held his world together while he was too broken to hold it himself, and something in the recognition of all of this moved through his face with the force of something too large for the kitchen table. "Your mother," he said to Theresa, "would have liked him very much." Theresa felt her throat close. She kept her composure. "Yes," she said, "I know." The quiet title hearing on Friday was brief and clear. Judge Weathering was indeed the man Croft had described, more comfortable with established wealth than with frontier homesteaders, but he was also a man who could read a document, and the Bancroft documents were unambiguous. The chain of title was clean, the homestead patent was valid, the deed was authentic, the mortgage was in good standing following the cure of default. He granted the quiet title after 40 minutes of hearing, entered it into the public record, and adjourned. Outside the courthouse, in the cold November air, Theresa stood with Croft and Phineas and her father, and allowed herself a single long breath of something that she recognized with some surprise as peace. Silas Holloway emerged from the courthouse behind them. He was a controlled man and he showed very little, but the set of his jaw told the story. He looked at Theresa and said nothing. He looked at Phineas and said nothing. He walked past them and got into his carriage and drove away. Croft watched him go. "He'll find another approach eventually," the old attorney said mildly. "Men like Holloway always do, but it will take years and you will be much better prepared." "I intend to be," Theresa said. She looked at Phineas, who was looking at her with the full warmth of his expression, the warmth he gave only to her, and she thought about what was next, which she had been thinking about with increasing concreteness for the past 2 weeks. What was next was a question, and the question was his. He asked it on Sunday afternoon, on the fence rail again in the low winter sun, with the grass gone dry and gold and the sky a clear hard blue. He had prepared for it, she could tell. He had thought about the words. He was a man who thought about words before he used them, who did not waste them, and when he turned to face her on the fence rail he held her gaze with the same unhurried certainty she had come to know as the essential quality of him. "Theresa," he said, "I came to Hayes County to find land. I found something better. I found something I have been looking for without knowing I was looking for it, which is the way you find the things that actually matter." She waited. "I want to stay," he said. "I want to stay here and build something that is worth staying for. I want to pay back your uncle's loan and the debt to Croft, and I want to work this land beside you and your father, and I want the Buckmaster lease to be a beginning and not an end." He paused. "But I don't want to do any of that as a hired hand or a neighbor or even a friend. I want to do it as your husband, if you'll have me." The wind moved the dry grass. The sky was enormous and blue. Theresa looked at him for a long time, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to be entirely present in the moment of being certain, because moments like this did not come twice. "Yes," she said. "I will have you, Phineas Barnett." He did not whoop or exclaim. He took her hands in both of his, and he brought them to his lips and kissed them, and then he looked at her over the tops of her fingers with the full, open warmth of a man who has arrived exactly where he was meant to be. They told Albert that evening. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands around his coffee cup, and his eyes bright with something that was not sadness, exactly, though it held the shape of it, the way happiness sometimes does when it comes at the far end of grief. "You have my blessing," he said to Phineas, "and my gratitude and my hope that you'll be patient with an old man who is slower than he used to be." "I'm in no hurry," Phineas said. "I know," Albert said. "That's one of the things I like best about you." They were married in December of 1883. The ceremony was at the Caldwell Methodist Church, which was a small white building with a wooden floor that creaked in the cold and a pot-bellied stove that Reverend Harmon kept stoked from October through March. There were 23 people in attendance, which was not a large number and was also the exact right number, the people who knew Theresa and Albert and who had been watching the fall's events with a quiet satisfaction at the outcome. Theresa wore her mother's dress. She had taken it in slightly at the waist, adjusted the hem, had added nothing and taken away nothing that was essential. She had pressed it with the flat iron the night before, slowly and carefully, and hung it on the door of the wardrobe. And in the morning she had put it on and stood before the glass and thought about Clara, about the morning Clara had put it on for the first time, about what her mother would have said and felt in this moment. She thought Clara would have been entirely pleased. Albert walked her down the aisle of the Methodist church on his arm, and he held himself straight in a way that cost him something and gave him something simultaneously. and when he put Theresa's hand in Phineas's, he held onto both their hands for a moment and then released them. Reverend Harmon read the words of the ceremony, and they were the old words, the right words, the words that have been used for this purpose long enough that they carry weight beyond their individual meaning. Theresa listened to them and felt the weight and also the lightness, the paradox of a serious thing that also makes the world feel larger and more possible than it did before. Phineas said his vows with his eyes on hers and his voice entirely steady. She said hers the same way. When Reverend Harmon said they were married, something in the room shifted, a collective exhale, the recognition of completion. People clapped. Elias Croft blew his nose with great feeling. Albert Bancroft pressed his fist to his mouth and looked at the ceiling. Phineas Barnett kissed his wife with the complete, unambiguous intention of a man who means what he does, and Theresa Bancroft, who was now Theresa Barnett, kissed him back. The winter that followed was the best winter Theresa could remember. This was partly because the legal threat was resolved and the homestead was secure, and the mortgage payments were current, and the title was clear, and the Holloways had retreated to their side of the county fence. Not gone, never entirely gone, but no longer actively dangerous. It was partly because William Bancroft had come to Caldwell for the wedding, and had stayed for a week, and he and Albert had found their way back to each other through 3 days of difficult conversation that Theresa had mostly stayed out of but had been aware of. And the old wound between the brothers had not healed entirely but had been cleaned and bandaged, which was a beginning. And it was partly, largely, most essentially, because she was sharing her life with Phineas Barnett, and every day of sharing it revealed something new to be glad of. He was a man who woke before dawn without complaint, who had coffee made before she was up, who worked without being asked and rested without guilt, who read in the evenings by lamplight and sometimes read aloud to her from the books that Croft kept recommending, his voice steady and warm in the lamplit kitchen with the winter wind pressing against the window glass. He was a man who laughed at things that were genuinely funny and did not pretend things were funny that were not, who told her the truth even when it was complicated, who listened to her with the full quality of his attention. They talked about everything. They talked about the land, about the debt still owed to William and Croft that they were paying down systematically, about the possibility of expanding the herd, about the winter wheat that was showing well despite the cold, about what the homestead could be in 5 years and 10 years and 20 years. They talked about Phineas's family in Texas, about the letter he had sent his mother after the wedding, about the letter his mother had sent back, which was 3 pages long and contained 7 book recommendations, and the remark that she had always suspected her second son would end up somewhere unexpected, and that a Kansas homesteader's wife sounded entirely right to her. They talked about Clara, about Albert's continued slow recovery, about what it meant to build a life in a place where the history was already written into the land. And they talked about the future, about children, with the careful and hopeful openness of 2 people who want the thing and understand that wanting alone does not summon it. In the spring of 1884, Theresa realized she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for a day before she told Phineas, not because she was afraid of telling him, but because she wanted a single day of holding it privately, of moving through the ordinary tasks of the morning with this extraordinary thing living quietly inside the knowledge of them. She fed the chickens and swept the porch and made bread and thought about her mother, who had held her in this same body's way, who had brought her into existence in a supply wagon in a blizzard, who had loved her with the complete competence of a woman who knew how to love. She told Phineas at the end of the day in the kitchen while the bread was cooling on the rack. She said it simply. She watched his face. He was still for exactly 1 moment, the moment of receiving something that has no precedent in your experience. Then the stillness broke into an expression of such complete, uncontrolled joy that she felt her own face mirror it involuntarily. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and said, "Theresa," with the particular emphasis that held the entirety of what he meant. "Yes," she said. He held her for a long time. She held him back. Outside the kitchen window the April light was going soft and gold, and somewhere in the pasture the mule was making its opinion known about something, and the bread smelled like bread, and the homestead was entirely and completely itself. She was moved into telling Albert at supper, and Albert sat with his hands around his coffee cup again in the posture that had become his way of receiving large things, and then he said, "Your mother told me, when Theresa was born, that becoming a grandparent was a thing she could not wait for." He paused. "I think I understand her now." The pregnancy was straightforward in the way that Clara Bancroft's pregnancies had been, which was to say it was not easy but it was not alarming, and Theresa managed it the way she managed everything, with practical attention and no self-pity. Phineas managed it the way he managed everything, which was by doing whatever was needed without theatrics, which included driving her to the doctor in Caldwell 3 times in the summer and once in the fall, building a proper cradle in the evenings with the focused attention of a man making something that matters, and reading aloud more frequently, which she had begun to think had become its own form of nesting. The baby arrived in November of 1884, a year after the Harvest Dance, a year after the ivory dress in the doorway of the Grange Hall. It was a boy. He was large and loud and had Phineas's dark hair and Theresa's stubborn jaw, and when Phineas held him for the first time in the bedroom of the Bancroft homestead, with the November wind outside and the lamp burning warm inside, his face had the same unguarded quality it had in the pasture when she had first told him she loved him. They named him Albert James Barnett. Albert, for the grandfather who held him the following morning with hands that shook slightly and eyes that did not. James, for Phineas's father in Nacogdoches, who sent a letter that arrived 3 weeks later, and who Phineas said was not a demonstrative man, but whose letter was 4 pages long. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was the richest winter Theresa could imagine. The homestead was full in a way that a homestead can only be full when there is a child in it, not just the busyness of it but the fullness, the weight of presence that a new person adds to a place. Albert Bancroft, who had been fading since Clara's death, found in his grandson something that pulled him back, toward himself with a force that medicine and time and even his children's love had not fully managed. He held the baby with the competence of a man who had done it before and remembered how, and he talked to him in the low, steady voice he had once used to tell Theresa bedtime stories, and something in the doing of it repaired something in him. Phineas watched this happen with the quiet gratitude of a man who understands that the best outcomes are sometimes the ones you did not plan for. In the spring of 1885, Theresa and Phineas had a conversation that they had been approaching for months from adjacent angles, the conversation about what they were building. The Buckmaster lease had expired in February. The Barnett family had effectively been operating the Bancroft homestead as their own since the wedding, and the legal and financial realities of this needed to be addressed with the same clarity that had served them throughout. Theresa had been thinking about it. Phineas had been thinking about it. They sat at the kitchen table one evening after Albert was in bed and the baby was asleep and went through it together. The mortgage on the homestead had been paid down to the point where the remaining debt was manageable. William Bancroft's loan had been fully repaid the previous fall, which had produced in William a letter of such warm affection that Theresa had cried reading it, and that had been the beginning of a genuine correspondence between Caldwell and Abilene. Croft's fees had been settled. What Phineas had was the savings he had not spent on the cure of default payment, the $50 having been repaid to him by Theresa from the first good wheat harvest, and a winter's worth of wages from work he had done for 2 neighboring ranches, while the Barnett operation was establishing itself. What they together had was the homestead, the clear title, the winter wheat, the cattle they had been slowly adding to the herd, and the knowledge of how to work land together. "I want to acquire the Pearly parcel," Phineas said. Theresa had been thinking about the Pearly parcel too. It was 40 acres that abutted the Bancroft homestead's northern edge, land that old Henry Purley had been farming alone since his wife died, and that he had been talking about selling for 2 seasons, as his age made the work less possible. It had a good creek run and excellent grazing potential, and it would add 40 acres to their operation in the direction that made the most sense for expansion. "Henry wants fair value," she said, "which is approximately $300. "I have 160 saved," Phineas said. "If we can arrange a note with Croft as intermediary, not through Holloway's bank, we can manage the rest over 2 seasons. "Croft would do it," she said. "He has told me twice that he considers our family a good risk." Phineas looked at her across the table. "Our family," he said, and the echo of the phrase in his voice held the warmth of a man who has not taken a single moment of what he has for granted. "Our family," she said. "They bought the Purley parcel in the fall of 1885. Henry Purley sold them the land, shook Phineas's hand, and moved to live with his daughter in Wichita. The note with Croft was for $140 at fair interest, fully documented, and they paid it off in 18 months. The Barnett homestead, as it was now properly called, had grown to 200 acres. During those years, the injustice that the Holloways represented did not disappear from the county, and Theresa was clear-eyed about this in a way that she did not paper over with optimism. Silas Holloway continued to acquire land through the mechanisms of financial pressure and legal maneuvering that had always been his method. There were families who were not as fortunate as the Bancrofts had been, families without a Croft to go to, without a Phineas to help, without a William to send a bank draft. Theresa thought about this. She was not a woman who thought about a problem without also thinking about what could be done about it. In 1886, she began hosting a monthly meeting at the Barnett homestead for the farm families of the northern part of the county. She invited Croft, who came with his bookshelves full of knowledge and his willingness to speak plainly about what rights a homesteader had and how to exercise them. She invited women whose husbands were too proud or too busy to seek help until the crisis was upon them. She made coffee and put food on the table and created a space in which the sharing of information was normal and the asking of questions was safe. Phineas supported this with the practical efficiency with which he supported everything she did that he believed in, which meant he extended the porch to accommodate more seating and made sure the coffee supply was never short, and gave her the time to prepare for these meetings without making her feel she was taking anything from the household. The meetings grew. By 1887, they included 30 families. By 1888, they had produced 2 formal legal challenges to Holloway's practices, one of which resulted in a county commissioner's review that, while it did not ruin Holloway, significantly curtailed his ability to use certain foreclosure maneuvers without due process. Silas Holloway lived to see this and did not appreciate it, and was never foolish enough to move against the Barnetts directly again. Jacob Holloway, who had never developed either his father's intelligence or his patience, left Caldwell in 1887 for opportunities in Oklahoma Territory that Theresa heard nothing more about. The Barnett household in those years was a place of genuine happiness, which is not to say it was a place of unbroken ease, because the frontier was not a place of unbroken ease for anyone. There were seasons when the rain failed and the crops came in short. There was a year when Phineas's health went wrong with a fever that kept him in bed for 2 weeks and frightened Theresa in a way that she did not show him because showing him would have frightened him, and she needed him to rest. And she sat at the edge of his bed in the evenings with a book and read aloud in the lamplight with her heart doing quiet, frightened things until the fever broke on the 9th day and he sat up and looked at her with clear eyes and said, "You've been terrified." "Of course I have," she said. "I'm better," he said. "I can see that," she said. "Don't do it again." He laughed, which was the best sound she had heard in 9 days. In 1888, Theresa told him she was pregnant again. This time he was in the kitchen when she told him, cutting wood for the stove, and he put down the hatchet with a careful deliberateness that held all the emotion his face did not yet. "Another," he said. "Another," she said. "Albert James will be 4, he said. "He'll have opinions. He will have strong opinions about everything for the rest of his life," she said. "That appears to be established." Phineas smiled. He walked to her and put his hand against her cheek, and she leaned into it. "Good," he said. "I like people with opinions." He looked at her steadily. "Are you well?" "Entirely," she said. He kissed her forehead. He held her for a moment in the kitchen, with the wood chips on the floor and the stove going and the November afternoon pressing cold against the windows. And she thought about the same kitchen 5 years earlier, about the braided rag rug and the tin box of documents, and the coffee that had been the beginning of a trust. And she felt the passage of those 5 years not as distance from what had happened, but as the substance of what she had built. The second baby arrived in July of 1889, in the summer heat, and it was a girl. She had Theresa's dark eyes and Phineas's lean face, and an immediate concentrated fury at the fact of being alive that the doctor said was entirely normal and Phineas said he recognized. They named her Clara. The naming of her was not a complicated conversation. They had talked about it during the pregnancy, had considered other names and returned to the same one, because there was only one name that was right and they both knew it: Clara Barnett. After Clara Bancroft, who had folded an ivory dress in cedar and lavender and waited for the right time. Albert Bancroft held his granddaughter 3 hours after she was born, in the July evening light, with Albert James sitting at his feet asking questions about why the baby was making that noise, and whether she would be able to walk soon, and whether she could come outside. Albert looked at the baby and said, in a voice so quiet it was almost not spoken, "Hello, Clara." And something about the saying of it completed a circle that had been open since October of 1882. Albert Bancroft died in the winter of 1890, peacefully, in his own bed, in the house he had built with his own hands, with Theresa at one side and Phineas at the other, and the sound of his grandchildren breathing in the next room. He had been failing slowly for several months, had known it, and accepted it with the same settled quality that Clara had shown before him, had put his affairs in order with the help of Croft, had written a letter to his brother William in Abilene that William received and answered, and that produced in its last weeks a renewed correspondence that Albert read with pleasure in his armchair by the window. He died holding Theresa's hand, and the last thing he said was her mother's name. Theresa cried after, fully and without reserve, for the first time since standing at Clara's grave in 1882. She cried with Phineas's arms around her in the kitchen, with the winter dark outside and the lamp burning, and he held her without speaking because there was nothing to say, and the holding was the true thing. She emerged from the grief not the same as before, which is how it is with true grief, but with the additional weight and substance that comes from having carried a complete love for a person all the way to the end of it. She had been her father's daughter and her mother's daughter, had held what they built and extended it and made it new without erasing what it had been, and she understood that this was both the obligation and the gift of love across time. The Barnett homestead continued. The years moved with the particular rhythm of a life built around the land and the seasons, around the needs of children and animals and crops and community. Albert James grew into a boy of strong opinions and strong legs who could outrun every child in his school year, and who had inherited his great-uncle's facility with numbers and his grandmother's intensity, and who told his father at age 7 that he intended to be a surveyor, which changed to wanting to be a doctor at age 9 and a cattle broker at age 11, and Phineas listened to each of these with equal seriousness. Clara grew into a girl who was quieter than her brother and more observant, who noticed things, who had her father's quality of full attention and her mother's directness, and who at the age of 5 told Theresa that the ivory dress in the cedar chest was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen and asked if she could try it on. Theresa sat on the edge of the bed and watched her daughter stand in the too large dress with her small hands holding the full skirt out to her sides, and she felt the continuity of it in her chest, the line that ran from Clara Bancroft to Theresa Bancroft to Clara Barnett through the medium of an ivory dress and forget-me-nots, and the love that a woman carries for the people who made her. "It was your grandmother's," Theresa said. "The one I'm named for," Clara said. "Yes," Theresa said. "She wore it to her wedding, and I wore it to the harvest dance the night I met your father." Clara considered this with the gravity of a 5-year-old receiving important information. "Will I wear it?" she asked. "When you're grown," Theresa said. "When the time is right." Clara nodded, accepting this the way children accept truth spoken without condescension, and spun in the dress in a slow circle, and Theresa watched her and felt Clara Bancroft in the room so strongly that she had to breathe through it, and then felt the comfort of it, the way memory that has been held long enough becomes a kind of company. Phineas found her there a few minutes later, standing in the doorway of the bedroom watching their daughter spin in the ivory dress, and he came to stand beside her, and she leaned into him without quite deciding to, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together watching. "Her grandmother would have loved her," he said. "Yes," Theresa said. "She would have been entirely impossible to manage." He laughed quietly. "Like her mother." She turned to look at him with an expression that held the mock severity and the complete warmth simultaneously, the look that was entirely theirs, that had developed over 7 years of conversation and shared work and honest love. "Are you suggesting I was difficult?" she said. "I'm suggesting," he said, "that you were exactly what was required." She looked at him for a moment, at the lines that the Kansas sun and wind had put in his face over the years they had been together, at the dark hair that was beginning to gray at the temples, at the steady, clear eyes that had looked at her across a room full of whispers on an October night and seen her clearly. "So were you," she said. He kissed her temple. Clara Barnett, who had spun 3 complete circles in her grandmother's dress, caught sight of her parents from across the room and made a face of elaborate theatrical disgust, because she was 5 years old and this was the appropriate response, and both her parents laughed. The Barnett homestead stood on 200 acres of Hays County, Kansas, at the beginning of the 1890s, and it was what it had been built to be, a place of work and love and continuity, a place where the history was held with respect and the future was opened with intention. The debt to Croft was long paid. The mortgage was in its final years. The herd numbered 40 good cattle. The wheat came in well more seasons than not, and in the bad seasons they were prepared. Elias Croft retired fully in 1891 and moved to live with his daughter in Kansas City. And before he left, he gave Theresa the legal reference book she had borrowed 7 years ago and never quite returned, with a note inside the cover that said it had been given more use in her hands than in his, and it belonged there. She kept it on the shelf between her mother's Bible and a collection of poems that Phineas had brought back from a supply trip to Wichita. The county changed around them, as counties do. The open range era was ending, the wire fences going up, the trail drives becoming less necessary as the railroad spread. New families came and old families moved on. Caldwell grew and changed in the way that frontier towns either grew into real towns or dried up, and Caldwell was growing. William Bancroft came to visit twice in those years, staying a week each time, and the uncle and niece relationship that had been so thin at the time of the crisis had been fully rebuilt into something genuine. He doted on Albert James in the way of a man without grandchildren, and he told Phineas once, on the porch after supper, that he had thought himself a practical man all his life, but that what Phineas had done for his niece in 1883 was the most practically useful thing he had ever seen, and he was grateful for it every time he thought about Theresa's situation in those weeks and how it might have gone differently. Phineas said, as he always said when anyone gave him credit for that time, that Theresa had done it herself, and that he had been privileged to watch. William Bancroft shook his head. "You're going to let her have all the credit no matter what I say," he said. "Credit for what actually happened," Phineas said. "Yes." In 1892, Theresa told Phineas she was pregnant a third time. She was 29 years old, which was not unusual for a third child in frontier families, and she told him on a spring morning in the garden where she was putting in the kitchen plants, and he was there with her because he had been helping turn the soil. And when she told him, he sat back on his heels in the dirt and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been repeatedly given more than he expected and has not yet stopped being surprised by it. "We are," he said, "extraordinarily fortunate people." "We are," she agreed. "Also, I would like you to build an addition to the house because we are running out of room." He laughed. "Yes," he said. "I'll start measuring." The addition was built through the summer with the help of 2 neighboring farm men who came for a week in the manner of a frontier building cooperation, fed and housed and sent home with standing invitations to return. It added 2 rooms to the east side of the house, proper rooms with windows, the kind of rooms that said permanence rather than improvisation. The third baby arrived in October of 1892, a boy. He was quieter from the start than his brother had been, more watchful, and had his mother's dark eyes and his father's ease in his own skin, and they named him James William Barnett, the James for Phineas's father and the William for Theresa's uncle, who received word of the naming via telegram and sent a response that was one line: "I am honored and will send boots." He sent boots. They were far too large but were stored with great care for the years when they would fit. Albert James was 8 years old when his youngest brother was born, and he received the news of another sibling with the resigned acceptance of a boy who has already been outmaneuvered by a sister and understands that brothers only compound the problem. But within 3 months, he was deeply invested in James William's existence in the specific way of eldest children who have decided that a younger sibling is in their care, showing him things and explaining things, and being generally more tender than his public persona of rough practicality would suggest. Clara was 3 and treated her youngest brother with the focused attention she gave everything, which was intense and occasionally alarming for a baby receiving it. The Barnett household was full. And Theresa, in the evenings of those years, when the children were in bed, and the house was settling into its night sounds and Phineas was in the armchair with a book, and the lamp was throwing its warm light across the room, would sometimes sit with the particular stillness of a person taking stock of what they have, and feel the weight and warmth of it. The full, improbable existence of the life that had been built from the moment a woman in ivory silk and forget-me-nots had walked into a Grange hall and refused to be diminished. She thought about her mother, which she did every day, which she expected to do every day for the rest of her life. She thought about the cedar chest and the hope and the waiting and the dress kept for the right time. The dress was in the cedar chest still, with the cedar and lavender waiting for Clara. She thought about the dance, about the moment in the doorway with the lamplight and the whispers and the music, about the decision she had made to walk in anyway, about the specific quality of that moment before everything changed, about the man who crossed the room, about 6 words. "That dress suits you fine," Miss 6 words that had seen her clearly when the room was doing its best to look away. 6 words that had been the beginning of everything. She looked at Phineas across the lamplight, at the man who had ridden into Hayes County looking for land and found something better, who had sat at her mother's table and drunk her coffee, and looked at her family's documents with honest eyes and said the truth of what he saw, who had stood beside her in the cold outside Holloway's bank, who had held her in grief and laughed with her in joy, and worked beside her in the long, ordinary days that are the actual substance of a life. He looked up from his book and found her watching him, and he smiled with the particular warmth of a man who has not for a single day stopped being glad of where he is. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She considered this, the full genuine complexity of everything she was thinking, and then she said the truest and simplest version of it. "That I am glad I wore the dress," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He understood what she meant, all of it, the whole reach and depth of it, because he was a man who listened with full attention. "So am I," he said, "every day." She smiled at him. He smiled at her. The lamp burned steady in the Kansas night. Outside, the wind moved through the grass in the way it always had, in the way it would continue to move long after all of them were gone, steady and indifferent, and also, somehow, like a companion. The Barnett homestead stood on its 200 acres under the enormous Kansas sky, its rooms full of sleeping children, and a history of courage and a future still opening ahead of it like the grassland itself, in every direction, wide and unfinished and entirely full of possibility. The ivory dress waited in the cedar chest. The forget-me-nots were sewn into the silk by a woman who had understood that some things are worth keeping, worth preserving against the day when they will be needed, against the day when the time is right. Clara Bancroft had known this, had folded the dress with care and pressed the cedar close and waited for the daughter she was raising, had trusted the future to find its use for what she left behind. She had not been wrong. She was not wrong. The dress would be worn again when Clara Barnett was grown, when the time was right, on whatever night she found herself walking toward a life she was choosing freely with her heart open and her chin up, and her mother's love pressed into the silk around her. It would hold the history it had always held, the wedding and the dance and the doorway and the whispers and the 6 words that had changed everything, and it would hold whatever new history came next, as it had always been meant to. Theresa put down her mending. She crossed the room and sat on the arm of Phineas's chair, and he shifted to make room for her without looking up from his book, the unconscious accommodation of 2 people who have made space for each other so long that it is simply how they occupy the world. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The lamp burned. The wind moved the grass. The Barnett homestead held its ground under the wide and endless Kansas sky, settled and certain and alive, in the particular way that things built by love and maintained by love and filled with love are alive, in all the ways that matter, in every direction, without end.